She had never expected that a normal evening at work would turn into a moment that would change how people saw her forever. It was one of those places where everything looked expensive and polished, with soft lights hanging from the ceiling and quiet music playing in the background. The guests were usually people who spoke softly but carried themselves with confidence, as if they were used to being listened to more than they listened to others. She worked there quietly, moving from table to table, making sure everything was in place, keeping her head low, and trying not to draw attention to herself. That evening had started like any other. The air smelled faintly of fresh food and polished wood. Glasses clinked gently, and soft conversations filled the room like a steady hum. She moved carefully between tables, carrying out her duties with patience. Most people did not even notice her unless they needed something, and she preferred it that way. It made her work easier when she could stay unseen. But something unusual happened later that night. A small gathering had been arranged in one corner of the hall. A few guests had decided to continue their evening with light entertainment. There was a piano placed near a wide window, not something that was used often, more like decoration than anything else. It had been a long time since anyone touched it. As the conversations continued, someone casually mentioned that it would be nice if someone played something on the piano. The idea floated in the air without much seriousness at first. People smiled, but no one stepped forward. A few looked around, half expecting a professional performer to appear, but there was no one like that present. The suggestion almost faded away until someone's eyes fell on her. She had just been passing by, holding a tray, when she noticed a few of the guests looking in her direction. At first, she did not understand why. Then one of them spoke politely, asking if she could play the piano. The question caught her completely off guard. She stopped for a moment, unsure if she had heard correctly. She was not a performer, not someone trained for attention. She was just doing her job. There was a brief silence. A few guests exchanged looks. Some seemed curious, while others looked doubtful, as if the idea itself was amusing. She felt the weight of that moment press gently on her. She had not planned for anything like this. Her hands tightened slightly around the tray she was holding. She thought about refusing, about simply smiling and walking away. That would have been the easiest choice. But the piano stood near the window, quiet and still, almost waiting. And something about it made her pause. It reminded her of something she had not thought about in a long time. A part of her life that had been hidden away, locked behind years of responsibility and silence. She had not touched a piano in a very long time, not since life had taken her in a different direction. One of the guests repeated the request gently, saying it did not have to be anything complicated, just a simple tune. There was no pressure in their voice, but still, all eyes slowly began to settle on her. The room felt different now, as if time had slowed slightly. She could feel the attention that she usually avoided. After a moment of hesitation, she slowly nodded. It was not a confident yes. It was quiet, uncertain, almost like she was agreeing to something she did not fully understand herself. She placed the tray carefully on a nearby surface and walked toward the piano. Each step felt heavier than the last, not because she was afraid of the instrument, but because she knew people were watching her with expectations she did not feel ready for. As she reached the piano, she stood for a moment without sitting down. The black surface reflected the soft lights above her. Her fingers hovered slightly above the keys. She could feel her heart beating a little faster than usual. Behind her, the room was still filled with soft conversations, but they seemed quieter now, as if curiosity was slowly pulling attention away from everything else. She finally sat down. The chair felt slightly unfamiliar, like it belonged to someone else. She placed her hands gently on the keys but did not press anything immediately. Her mind was calm on the surface, but inside, memories were beginning to rise quietly. She remembered a time when music was not something distant, when it had been part of her daily life in a different way. She had learned music when she was younger, not in a professional way that brought fame or recognition, but in a personal, quiet way. It had been something she loved deeply. There were days when she would spend hours practicing simple melodies, repeating notes until they felt like part of her breathing. But life had changed. Responsibilities had grown. Dreams had been set aside to make space for survival, for work, for stability. And slowly, the piano had disappeared from her life. Now, sitting in front of it again, she felt a strange mix of emotions she could not easily name. It was not just nervousness. It was something deeper, like meeting an old friend after many years of silence. She could feel the weight of the room behind her, but she tried to focus only on the keys in front of her. One of the guests softly reminded her that it was fine to just play something simple. That sentence brought her back slightly. Yes, simple. That was all they expected. A simple tune. Nothing more. Nothing that would stand out or demand attention. She took a slow breath. Her fingers finally pressed the first key. The sound was soft, clear, and slightly fragile at first. It filled the space gently, almost hesitantly. A few people stopped talking. Not because they expected anything special, but because sound naturally draws attention in a quiet room. She continued slowly, playing the simple tune she had been asked for. Her posture was careful, controlled, as if she was still unsure whether she belonged there. At first, it was exactly what everyone had expected. Nothing extraordinary. Just a soft, simple melody floating through the room. Some guests even looked away again, returning to their conversations, satisfied that it was just background music. But she kept playing. And something began to change inside her as she continued. Her fingers, once hesitant, started to find a rhythm they remembered. It was not forced. It was as if her hands were slowly waking up after a long sleep. The simple tune was still there, but beneath it, something deeper was beginning to form quietly, something not yet visible to the people watching. She did not notice the change at first. She was still focused on the memory of the tune, trying to keep it simple as requested. But emotions have a way of finding their own path. And as she continued, the piano began to feel less like a task and more like a voice she had forgotten she had. In the room behind her, a few guests started to glance back again. Something about the sound was slightly different now, though they could not explain what it was. It still sounded simple on the surface, but there was a feeling growing inside it, something soft and unspoken, like a story slowly unfolding without words. She kept playing, unaware that the room was beginning to pay closer attention again. At first, the room did not fully change. It still carried the same soft sound of distant conversations, the gentle clinking of glass, and the quiet movement of people who were used to luxury and calm surroundings. But something small had shifted. It was not loud. It was not obvious. It was just a feeling, like a slight change in the air that only a few people noticed at the beginning. She was still sitting at the piano, continuing the simple tune she had been asked to play. Her hands moved carefully over the keys, staying within the limits of what she thought was expected from her. She was not trying to impress anyone. She was simply following what had been requested. A simple melody. Nothing more. Nothing complicated. Just something soft in the background while people enjoyed their evening. But people do not always stay focused on their own conversations when something unfamiliar happens nearby. At first, only a few guests turned their attention back toward her. One of them looked slightly surprised, as if they had expected the music to fade into the background, but instead it seemed to be holding its place in the room more firmly than before. Another guest, sitting a little further away, paused mid-conversation. They did not speak. They just listened for a moment, as if trying to understand why the sound felt slightly different from what they had expected. It was still the same piano, still the same simple tune, but there was something about the way it was being played that made it feel less ordinary. Still, most of the room did not react strongly. People in places like this were used to music, used to performances, and used to background entertainment. They had seen trained performers, skilled musicians, and carefully planned events. So at first, there was no reason for them to believe that this moment was anything special. Some even thought it was just a polite gesture, a simple attempt to fill silence. She, on the other hand, remained focused on the keys. Her eyes stayed lowered, and her expression remained calm but slightly tense. She was not fully relaxed. Even though she had agreed to play, she still felt like she was stepping outside her usual place. Every note she played carried a small part of her attention, as if she was carefully checking herself with every movement. The simple tune continued. Soft, controlled, familiar. But something inside her was slowly changing. It was not sudden. It was not dramatic. It was more like a quiet memory waking up after being asleep for a long time. Her fingers began to feel slightly more natural on the keys, as if they were remembering something she had not practiced in years but had never fully forgotten. Behind her, the room slowly began to shift in attention again. One guest stopped looking at their phone. Another leaned slightly forward without realizing it. A few conversations started to fade, not because anyone asked them to stop, but because attention naturally begins to drift when curiosity grows. Still, there was doubt. That was the strongest feeling in the room. Some people assumed she was just playing a basic tune she had learned long ago, nothing more. They thought it was a polite effort, something simple to entertain for a short moment. A few even smiled quietly, thinking it was harmless and unimportant. In their minds, there was no reason to expect anything beyond what they had already seen. But doubt has different forms. While some people ignored the music, others began to judge it quietly. A few guests exchanged subtle looks, the kind that did not need words. Their expressions suggested confusion, even mild disbelief that this was the performance being offered to them. One guest leaned slightly toward another and whispered something under their breath. The words were not clear, but the expression carried a hint of uncertainty. It was the kind of doubt that grows when expectations do not match reality. They had expected either nothing special or something clearly professional. What they were hearing felt like something in between, something they could not easily categorize. She did not notice these reactions clearly. Her focus was still on the piano. But she could feel the room in a general sense. She could feel the silence growing in small pockets behind her. She could feel attention slowly increasing, even if she did not fully understand why. Her hands continued to move. The simple tune remained intact, but now there was something subtle beneath it. A slight variation in rhythm. A small shift in emotion. Nothing dramatic enough to announce itself, but enough to slowly change how the sound filled the room. A few more heads turned. This time, the attention was more deliberate. Not accidental. Not casual. People were starting to listen more carefully. Some stopped their conversations entirely. Others looked toward the piano without speaking. The atmosphere, once relaxed and social, was now becoming focused in a quiet, growing way. Still, the doubt remained. Not everyone was convinced that anything meaningful was happening. Some guests continued to believe it was just a simple performance, nothing more than a basic tune being played competently. In their minds, there was still no reason to expect anything surprising. After all, she was not introduced as a performer. She was not announced. She was not presented as someone with musical training. She was simply someone who had been asked to play a simple tune. And that belief shaped how some of them listened. But the sound itself was slowly beginning to challenge that belief. There was a moment when the melody slightly changed in tone. It was still recognizable, still simple in structure, but the emotion behind it seemed to deepen without warning. It was not loud. It was not sudden. It was subtle, like a color becoming richer without changing its shape. One guest frowned slightly, as if trying to understand what had just changed. Another tilted their head, listening more closely now. A few people who had not been paying attention earlier suddenly found themselves drawn back toward the piano without realizing it. The room was no longer fully divided between conversation and music. The music was starting to take more space, even if quietly. Still, doubt lingered strongly. Some people refused to shift their expectations. They told themselves it was just a simple tune, that nothing special was happening, and that it was only their imagination making it feel different. They tried to return to their conversations, but their attention kept drifting back again. Others began to feel slightly uncomfortable, not because the music was unpleasant, but because it was harder than expected to ignore. It was as if the sound was quietly asking to be listened to, even without any force. She continued playing, unaware of how deeply the room was beginning to divide in attention. Some guests watched her with mild curiosity. Others with quiet skepticism. A few with growing interest they could not explain. But none of them yet fully understood what was beginning to form through her hands. The simple tune was still there, but something underneath it was starting to grow, like a hidden layer slowly becoming visible, not all at once, but piece by piece, note by note, without announcement. And in that moment, the room did not yet know that what they were hearing was no longer just a simple tune being played for convenience. It was becoming something else entirely, even if no one was ready to admit it yet. She kept her eyes on the piano keys, not looking up even once. The world around her felt distant, almost like it was slowly fading into the background. At first, she had only intended to play the simple tune she was asked for, nothing more. That was what everyone expected, and she had agreed to it quietly without thinking too much. But now, as her fingers moved across the keys, something inside her felt different. The melody was still simple on the surface. Anyone listening casually would have said it was just a basic tune being played for background music. But if someone truly listened, if they paid even a little more attention, they would notice something subtle beginning to form beneath it. It was like a soft thread of emotion slowly weaving itself into the sound. In the room, people were still not fully sure how to react. A few continued their conversations, though their voices were quieter now. Others had stopped speaking completely but were still unsure why they were so drawn to the music. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It did not demand attention. And yet, it was slowly taking it anyway. She did not notice this shift clearly. She was focused on the piano, on the memory of the tune she had started with. Her posture remained careful, almost controlled, as if she was still holding herself back. She was not performing in the way professionals do when they want to impress. She was simply playing, as if following something familiar deep inside her. But music has a way of changing when emotions enter it. And without her fully realizing it, emotion had started to slip into her playing. The first change was very small. A slight pause between notes, a softer touch on certain keys, a gentle variation in timing that was not planned but felt natural. It did not break the tune. It only added depth to it, like a painting slowly gaining more color in places where before there was only outline. A few guests noticed it this time. One person tilted their head slightly, as if unsure whether they had heard something different or imagined it. Another guest stopped mid-movement, glass still in hand, attention slowly shifting toward the piano. There was a growing sense in the room that something was not entirely ordinary anymore, even if no one could explain it clearly. Still, most people remained cautious in their judgment. They told themselves it was probably nothing special, just a simple tune being played a little differently. Maybe they were overthinking it. After all, she had not been introduced as a musician. She had not been announced as someone with any special background. In their minds, there was no reason to expect anything beyond what they had already seen. But the sound continued to evolve. She shifted into the next part of the melody without breaking the flow. Her fingers moved more smoothly now, less hesitant than before. It was almost as if her hands were remembering something her mind had not fully allowed her to think about yet. The simple tune was still there, but now it carried a softer emotional weight. Felt more personal, more expressive, still quiet, but no longer empty. In the room, attention was slowly changing. Conversations that had been continuing earlier were now fading completely. People were no longer pretending to listen while talking. They were either listening fully or not speaking at all. The space between sounds in the room was growing longer. She still did not look up, but she could feel it now. The silence behind her felt different, not uncomfortable but focused, like the room itself had started to lean toward the piano. She did not fully understand it, but a part of her became slightly more aware that people were paying attention. This awareness did something subtle to her. It did not make her nervous in the same way as before. Instead, it created a quiet pressure, like a reminder that she was not alone in the moment anymore. Someone was listening. More than one person, in fact. Her fingers moved again, and this time something changed more clearly. The rhythm of the tune began to stretch slightly, not breaking, not losing structure, but becoming more expressive. Certain notes were held just a little longer. Others were played more gently, almost like whispers. The melody was no longer just a sequence of notes. It was starting to feel like a feeling being expressed without words. A guest near the front leaned forward slightly without realizing it. Another person who had been standing turned fully toward the piano now, their full attention locked on her hands. There was still doubt in some parts of the room, but it was weakening. Because even those who wanted to dismiss it were finding it harder to ignore. The sound was no longer something that could be easily pushed into the background. She, however, remained in her own world. A world that was slowly becoming deeper than she expected. As she continued, a memory surfaced quietly in her mind. Not a clear picture, but a feeling. The feeling of sitting somewhere long ago, when music was not something she did for others, but something she did for herself. Back then, there was no audience, no expectation, just time, practice, and a connection with sound that felt natural. That memory did not come fully, came in pieces, but it was enough to change how she touched the keys. Her playing became slightly more confident, still controlled, still simple in structure, but now it carried something else inside it. Emotion. The room reacted again, this time more clearly. A few guests stopped pretending to be uninterested. Their eyes were now fixed on her. Even those who had been skeptical earlier were beginning to show signs of curiosity. Some leaned slightly forward in their seats. Others exchanged brief looks, as if silently asking each other whether they were hearing the same thing. There was no longer complete silence, but the conversations that remained were barely noticeable. The music was slowly taking over the space without asking permission. She continued playing, and now she felt it too. A small change inside herself. It was not confidence in the usual sense. It was something quieter, a feeling of flow, as if her hands were no longer separate from the sound they were creating. The piano was no longer just an object in front of her. It was becoming a voice she had not used in a long time, and that voice was beginning to grow. The simple tune she had started with was still there, but it was no longer alone. Something deeper was forming around it, slowly, carefully, almost like it had been waiting for the right moment to appear. In the room, even the air felt different now, heavier with attention, still quiet, but no longer casual. And without anyone realizing it yet, the moment had already passed the point of being just a simple request for background music. It was becoming something far more powerful, even though it had not fully revealed itself yet. She was still sitting at the piano, unaware of how much the room around her had already begun to change. To her, it still felt like she was simply following the request she had been given earlier. A simple tune. Nothing more. Something soft enough to stay in the background of an evening that belonged to others. That was what she had agreed to, and in her mind, she was still trying to stay within those limits. But the music no longer stayed within limits. It had started to grow quietly, like water slowly rising without making noise. The simple melody was still there, easy to recognize, but now it was no longer just simple. Something deeper was forming beneath it, something that could not be easily named. It was not louder. It was not faster. It was something else entirely. Something emotional, something alive in a way that surprised even those who were not fully paying attention. In the room, people began to notice that silence was taking over more and more. Conversations that had continued earlier were now fading completely. Glasses were still in hands, but fewer people were drinking. Movements slowed. Heads turned. The space that once felt casual and social now felt focused, almost as if everyone had silently agreed to listen without speaking about it. She did not see this clearly. Her eyes stayed on the keys. Her posture remained steady, but there was a change in the way her fingers moved. It was no longer just careful placement of notes. There was a sense of flow now, as if her hands were beginning to trust the sound more than her thoughts. And that is when the shift truly began. The melody changed shape without breaking. It still carried the original tune, but now it had layers. A soft rise in emotion, a gentle fall that felt almost like breathing. The kind of change that is not dramatic, but deeply felt when someone is truly listening. A few guests leaned forward slightly without realizing it. One person, who had been sitting back casually, now sat upright, eyes fixed on the piano. Another guest tilted their head, as if trying to understand how a simple request had turned into something that felt so different from what they expected. Still, there was hesitation in the room. Some people tried to explain it in their minds. They told themselves it was just a basic tune being played with slight variation. Maybe it was just their imagination. Maybe the quiet room was making everything feel more intense than it really was. That was easier to believe than accepting that something unexpected might be happening in front of them. But doubt was starting to weaken, because the music was no longer something that could be ignored. She felt it too now, even if she could not fully describe it. There was a sense of connection growing between her and the piano that she had not felt in a long time. It was not something she planned. It was not something she tried to create. It was something that was simply happening through her as she continued to play. Her fingers moved with more ease now. Less hesitation. More understanding. Each note seemed to lead naturally into the next, as if the piano itself was guiding her through something familiar but long forgotten. And in that moment, a deeper memory surfaced. Not a clear scene, but a feeling. A feeling of a younger version of herself sitting in front of music without fear. A time when she did not worry about being watched or judged. A time when playing was not about expectation, but about expression. That memory did not come fully into focus, but it was enough to change the way she touched the keys. The sound softened in some places and grew slightly stronger in others, not by force, but by emotion. It felt less like a performance and more like a conversation between her and something she had missed for a long time. In the room, attention was now fully captured. Even those who had been skeptical earlier were no longer looking away. Some people had stopped moving entirely, as if afraid that even a small sound might disturb what they were hearing. The atmosphere had shifted from casual observation to focused attention. There was no announcement, no introduction, no explanation, just the piano, and her. One guest, sitting near the side, quietly placed their glass down and did not pick it up again. Another person who had been slightly distracted earlier now looked completely focused, their eyes fixed on her hands as if trying to understand how those movements were producing such a sound. Still, the most surprising part was not the attention from the audience. It was the change in the music itself. Because now, even without her realizing it fully, the simple tune had begun to transform into something richer. Not complicated in structure, but deep in feeling. It carried something that made people pause inside their own thoughts. A sense of emotion that could not be easily explained. The room no longer felt like a gathering of separate conversations. It felt like a single shared moment, held together by sound. She continued playing, and now there was a quiet confidence growing inside her. Not confidence in the sense of performance, but something more personal. A feeling that she did not need to stop or question herself. She could simply continue, and so she did. The melody rose gently again, not suddenly, but like a slow breath being taken. It carried a softness that made the room even quieter. People who had been sitting far back were now fully attentive. Even those who had been indifferent earlier were now looking toward the piano without distraction. There was still disbelief in some faces, but it was no longer strong, because the sound was speaking louder than doubt. She pressed another set of keys, and this time the emotion in the music became more noticeable. It was still controlled, still gentle, but it had a depth that was impossible to ignore. It felt like something hidden was slowly being revealed, not all at once, but piece by piece. And the most surprising part was that she was not trying to impress anyone. She was simply playing. But what she did not yet realize was that the simplicity she believed she was following had already turned into something far beyond simple. In the room, silence had now fully taken over. Even breathing felt quieter. Even movement felt smaller. It was as if the entire space had agreed, without words, to let the piano speak without interruption. And as she continued, something even deeper was about to begin forming. Something that would soon make the entire room understand that they had completely underestimated the moment sitting right in front of them. The room had now fallen into a kind of silence that was very different from the beginning of the evening. It was not the silence of boredom or emptiness. It was the silence of attention. The kind of silence that happens when people stop thinking about everything else and start focusing on one single moment unfolding in front of them. She was still at the piano, unaware of how deeply she had already captured the room. To her, it still felt like she was simply continuing the tune she had been asked to play earlier. But what she did not realize was that the tune no longer existed in its simple form. It had grown into something far more powerful without her even trying. Her hands moved with steady control now, no longer hesitant. There was a natural flow in her playing that came from something deeper than practice. It felt like memory and emotion were working together through her fingers. She was not forcing anything. She was not trying to impress anyone. She was simply allowing the sound to come out as it wanted. And that is exactly what made it so powerful. In the room, the change was now impossible to ignore. A few guests who had been sitting casually earlier were now fully turned toward the piano. Their bodies had shifted without them noticing. Their conversations had completely stopped. Even those who had been mildly interested before were now watching with full attention. The sound was no longer background music. It had become the center of the room. Still, there was a moment where people tried to resist what they were feeling. Some told themselves it was just a simple performance that felt more emotional because of the quiet atmosphere. Others tried to remain calm and unaffected, thinking they should not be easily impressed. But the music made that difficult, because it was not trying to impress. It was expressing, and that difference slowly broke down the last layer of doubt. She continued playing, and now something deeper began to appear in the music. The melody she had started with was still present, but it had transformed. It carried emotion in a way that could not be ignored. It felt like a story being told without words. A story that did not belong to one person alone, but somehow felt familiar to everyone listening. In that moment, the room changed again, this time more strongly. A few guests leaned forward slightly, almost unconsciously. One person placed their hand on the table but forgot to move it for several seconds. Another quietly stopped breathing for a moment, completely absorbed in the sound. There was no longer confusion in most faces, only attention and growing disbelief, because what they were hearing did not match what they expected from the beginning. She was still focused on the piano, but something inside her had shifted as well. There was a feeling growing within her that she had not experienced in a long time. It was not nervousness anymore. It was something calmer, something more open, as if she was no longer holding herself back. The music reflected that change. It became smoother, deeper, more expressive. The simple tune had now fully transformed into something emotional and layered, even though it still carried its original structure underneath. And the room felt it. Every person listening could sense that something unusual was happening, even if they could not explain it clearly. It was not about technical skill alone. It was about feeling, something that reached beyond logic. A guest near the center of the room slowly put their phone down without realizing it. They had been holding it earlier, distracted like everyone else. But now it no longer mattered. The music had taken full attention away from everything else. Another guest quietly leaned back in their chair, eyes fixed on her hands, as if trying to understand how something so simple had turned into something so moving. Still, no one spoke. No one interrupted. It felt like speaking would break something delicate. And so the silence continued. She kept playing, and now her confidence had grown without her noticing. It was not the confidence of performance or show. It was the confidence of connection. As if she had found something within the music that belonged to her, something she had forgotten but never truly lost. Her fingers moved more freely now. Each note felt more natural. Each pause felt meaningful. The piano was no longer just an instrument in front of her. It had become a space where something inside her could finally breathe again. And that change was clearly reflected in the sound. The melody rose gently again, not suddenly, but like a slow emotional wave, carried warmth this time, a softness that made the room feel even quieter, even more focused. It was no longer just music filling the space. It was emotion filling the space. A few guests exchanged brief looks, not to talk, but to confirm that they were all feeling the same thing. There was no need for words. Their expressions said enough. Surprise, curiosity, and something closer to admiration. Even those who had been skeptical earlier were now fully attentive. The doubt was almost gone, because what they were witnessing no longer fit into the category of simple performance. It was something else. Something unexpected. Something real. She continued, and now there was a clear emotional shift in the music. It felt like it was telling something without telling it directly, like a hidden story slowly revealing itself through sound. Some parts felt soft and reflective. Others carried a quiet strength that came and went naturally. The room responded without speaking. A few people closed their eyes briefly, just to listen more deeply. Others kept watching her hands as if trying to understand the source of what they were hearing. But the truth was simple. It was not just her hands. It was everything inside her that had been silent for a long time finally finding a way to speak again. And that is what made it so powerful. The simple request that started it all no longer existed in the same form. It had become something far beyond what anyone in the room had expected. She was still playing. And the room was still listening. But now, something important had changed forever in the way they saw her, even though the final moment of shock had not yet fully arrived. The room had completely changed now, even though no one had spoken a single word about it. What started as a simple request for a soft piano tune had turned into something no one expected. The atmosphere that once felt casual and light was now heavy with attention, as if every person inside that room was holding the same thought at the same time. She was still sitting at the piano, her eyes focused on the keys, unaware of the full impact she had created. To her, it still felt like she was just continuing what she had started earlier. A simple tune that had slowly grown into something more emotional. She did not see herself as special in that moment. She did not feel like she was performing for anyone. She was simply lost in the flow of the music. But the people behind her saw something completely different. They were no longer watching a simple performance. They were witnessing something that had quietly broken every expectation they had formed at the beginning of the evening. The same person they had thought of as just a staff member passing by tables was now holding the attention of an entire room without saying a single word. The silence in the room was no longer uncomfortable. It was powerful. Even the smallest sound felt important now. A glass being moved slightly, a chair shifting gently, a soft breath taken by someone in the back row. Everything felt louder than before, not because the room had changed physically, but because attention had completely shifted toward the piano. She continued to play, and now her expression had changed slightly too. There was a calm focus on her face, but also something softer. Something almost peaceful. It was as if she had entered a space where time moved differently. A place where nothing else mattered except the sound she was creating. Her hands moved with confidence now. No hesitation, no doubt, just flow. The melody that had started as a simple tune had now become something deeply emotional. It carried layers that could not be easily explained. It felt like memories, emotions, and silence were all mixed together in sound. And every note seemed to carry a piece of something unspoken. In the room, people were no longer trying to understand it logically. They were simply feeling it. One guest quietly leaned back, their expression softened, as if something inside them had been touched without warning. Another person pressed their lips together, not speaking, but clearly moved by what they were hearing. A few others simply stared at her hands, as if trying to understand how such sound was coming from such quiet movement. But there was no clear answer, because what they were witnessing was not just skill, it was expression. And expression does not always follow rules. She kept playing, and now the music reached a point where it felt like it was speaking directly to the room. The softness remained, but there was strength inside it too. A quiet strength that grew and faded like breathing. It did not demand attention. It earned it, and that was what made it unforgettable. The last traces of doubt in the room had now almost disappeared completely. Even those who had earlier questioned why she was asked to play were now fully silent. Not because they had been told to be, but because they no longer had anything to say. The music had already answered every doubt without using words. She was not aware of any of this. To her, it was still personal, still connected to something deep inside her that she had not touched in a long time. Every note felt like it was pulling her further into a memory she had almost forgotten. A memory not of a specific moment, but of a feeling. a feeling of freedom, of expression, of being fully herself without fear. And that feeling was now flowing into the piano. The melody slowly began to soften again, like it was preparing to end. The emotional rise that had built earlier was now gently settling. It did not stop suddenly. It eased down carefully, like a story reaching its final page. The room noticed this shift immediately. People became even more still. There was a sense that something important was about to end, even though no one wanted it to. She continued playing the final part, and now every note felt intentional. Not rushed, not forced, just carefully placed like each one had meaning. The sound was no longer just music filling space. It was emotion slowly leaving the room in the most graceful way. A few guests closed their eyes without realizing it, as if they did not want to miss even a single moment of it. Others leaned slightly forward, holding onto the final seconds of sound. And then, slowly, the last notes arrived. Soft, clear, gentle. They did not end sharply. They faded, like a breath finishing naturally. And then silence. But this silence was different from all the silences before. It was not empty. It was full. Full of everything that had just been felt. For a few seconds, no one moved. No one spoke. No one clapped immediately. It was as if the entire room was trying to understand what had just happened, or maybe simply trying to stay inside that feeling a little longer. She sat still for a moment, her hands resting on the keys. She did not immediately turn around. She did not smile for attention. She simply remained there quietly, as if she herself was still coming back from somewhere deep inside the music. Then she slowly lifted her hands away from the piano. The silence remained, and then it broke. Not suddenly but gently at first. A few claps from somewhere in the room. Then more, and more, until it filled the entire space. The applause grew stronger, spreading through the room like a wave that could not be stopped. People who had been sitting quietly now stood up. Others clapped with clear emotion on their faces. Some were smiling. Some looked surprised even at their own reaction. And a few simply continued clapping without even looking away from the piano, still trying to process what they had just experienced. She finally turned around. For the first time in the entire performance, she looked at the room. And what she saw was something she had never expected. Every face was turned toward her. Not with indifference, not with doubt, but with admiration and genuine respect. For a moment, she just stood there quietly, not knowing how to respond. She was not used to this kind of attention. Not like this. Not for something she had never even planned as a performance. But even then, she did not change who she was. She gave a small, humble expression. Not proud. Not showy. Just simple acknowledgement. And then she stepped away from the piano. Still calm. Still quiet. But now something had changed forever in the way people saw her. Because what they had thought was an ordinary moment had turned into something they would remember for a long time. And she, without saying a single word, had proven something powerful. That hidden talent does not always announce itself. Sometimes, it simply waits for the right moment, and then quietly changes everything.